Hakodate Airport, Hokkaido, Japan. September 6, 1976, 1:11 p.m. Lieutenant Viktor Belenko pushed the throttles forward, feeling the Tumansky R-15B-300 engines roar to life beneath him. The MiG-25 Foxbat, the most feared interceptor in the Soviet arsenal, capable of Mach 3, designed to shoot down American SR-71 Blackbirds, was fueling up at Chuguyevka Air Base near Vladivostok. Around him, mechanics worked their routine checks. None of them knew that in exactly 37 minutes, Belenko would commit what Moscow would call the crime of the century, flying this $60 million aircraft, packed with the Soviet Union's most classified avionics and weapons systems, straight into the hands of the enemy. The 29-year-old pilot ran through his mental checklist one final time. His flight plan showed a routine training sortie. His actual destination, the civilian airport at Hakodate on Japan's northern island, lay just 350 miles southeast across the Sea of Japan. He had perhaps 90 seconds after takeoff before Soviet ground control would realize something was wrong. Then they would scramble interceptors. Then someone in Moscow would have to decide whether to shoot down their own pilot in their own aircraft rather than let the Americans get their hands on it. Belenko had spent 6 months planning this moment. He knew the Americans had been chasing the Foxbat's secrets for a decade, ever since the CIA first glimpsed grainy photos of the angular, supersonic beast. What they didn't know, what nobody in the West knew, was that the MiG-25 was both more impressive and more flawed than anyone imagined. Throughout the early 1970s, the MiG-25 Foxbat haunted Western strategic planning like a technological specter. NATO intelligence had pieced together enough satellite imagery and signals intercepts to know the Soviets had deployed an interceptor capable of speeds exceeding Mach 2.8 and operational altitudes above 80,000 feet. Pentagon analysts ran computer simulations showing the Foxbat could intercept virtually any Western aircraft. We believed we were facing a fighter that could outrun, outclimb, and potentially outturn anything in our inventory, admitted General David Jones, then Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force. The CIA's assessment was stark. The MiG-25 represented a quantum leap in Soviet aerospace capability. The fighter had first appeared in 1967, spotted during the Aviation Day flyover at Domodedovo Airport near Moscow. Western observers were stunned. The aircraft was massive, over 64 feet long with a 45-foot wingspan, yet clearly built for extreme speed. Intelligence photographs showed that distinctive angular design, those massive air intakes, the twin vertical stabilizers canted outward at rakish angles. When we first saw the Foxbat, we thought the Soviets had leapfrogged us technologically, recalled a senior CIA analyst involved in Soviet aerospace assessment. Pentagon war games throughout the early 70s showed American fighters struggling against this phantom adversary. The F-15 Eagle program, which would eventually cost over $20 billion, was developed specifically as a counter to the perceived MiG-25 threat. Soviet propaganda did nothing to dispel Western fears. Moscow boasted of the Foxbat's capabilities while carefully shrouding its specifications in secrecy. In 1973, a MiG-25 flown by test pilot Alexander Fedotov set an absolute altitude record of 123,524 feet, nearly 24 miles high, that stood for decades. Soviet test pilots established multiple time-to-climb records. The message was clear. The USSR had built a super fighter, and the technological edge the West had enjoyed since World War II was gone. President Nixon's science advisor noted in a classified 1972 memo that the MiG-25 represents our most significant intelligence gap in Soviet military aviation. The Air Force wanted to know everything. What were the engines made of? How did the Soviets solve the titanium welding problem? What radar and weapon systems did it carry? How vulnerable would American bombers be in a nuclear exchange? What Western intelligence didn't know, couldn't know from satellite photos and signals intercepts, was that Soviet engineers had made fundamental compromises in the Foxbat's design. They didn't know the aircraft was built primarily from nickel steel rather than titanium, making it far heavier than Western designs. They didn't know the massive engines guzzled fuel at such prodigious rates that combat radius was severely limited. They didn't know that above Mach 2.5, the engines would literally destroy themselves if sustained for more than a few minutes. Most critically, they didn't know that Soviet avionics were a generation behind Western systems, that the radar was based on vacuum tubes rather than solid-state electronics, and that the Foxbat's celebrated speed came at the cost of maneuverability. The aircraft could barely pull 4.5 Gs at high speed without risking structural failure. In Moscow, the leadership knew these limitations, but also understood the psychological advantage their strategic ambiguity provided. Leonid Brezhnev's government was content to let the Americans spend billions chasing a threat that was simultaneously real and exaggerated. Marshal Pavel Kutakov, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Air Force, had personally overseen the MiG-25's deployment to forward bases near NATO borders, knowing that each radar contact would set Western military planners scrambling. It was strategic deception on a grand scale. Until Viktor Belenko decided to end it all, the MiG-25 was born from Cold War paranoia and technical brilliance in equal measure. In 1959, Soviet intelligence learned that the United States was developing the XB-70 Valkyrie, a strategic bomber designed to penetrate Soviet airspace at Mach 3 and altitudes above 70,000 feet. Existing Soviet interceptors were useless against such a threat. Premier Nikita Khrushchev personally demanded that the aviation design bureaus create a counter-weapon. The task fell to the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau, specifically to lead designer Rostislav Belyakov, working under the legendary Artem Mikoyan. The engineering challenge was immense. Sustained flight at Mach 3 generates temperatures exceeding 300 degrees Celsius, hot enough to weaken most metals. The Americans were pursuing titanium construction for their SR-71 reconnaissance aircraft. But Soviet metallurgy wasn't advanced enough for large-scale titanium fabrication. Belyakov's team made a pragmatic decision. They would use nickel-steel alloy for 80% of the airframe, with titanium only in the hottest zones around the engines. This made the aircraft heavy, over 41,000 pounds empty, but buildable with existing Soviet industrial capacity. We didn't have the luxury of waiting for perfect materials, Belyakov later explained in his memoirs. We built what we could build, and we built it to do one job: destroy American strategic bombers before they could reach Soviet cities. The first prototype flew on March 6, 1964, piloted by Georgy Mosolov. The program proceeded rapidly by Soviet standards, driven by Kremlin pressure and substantial resource allocation. By 1970, the MiG-25P interceptor variant was entering operational service with the Soviet Air Defense Forces. The P designation stood for Perekhvatchik, interceptor. It carried 4 R-40 air-to-air missiles, weighed over 9 tons fully loaded, and could theoretically reach Mach 283 at altitude. The Smerch A radar could detect bomber-sized targets at ranges approaching 100 kilometers. On paper, it was formidable. In practice, it was a specialized tool, extraordinarily good at one specific mission, mediocre at almost everything else. Viktor Ivanovich Belenko had grown up in Nalchik, a city in the North Caucasus region, in a society that promised equality, but delivered privilege based on party loyalty and ethnic Russian heritage. Born in 1947 into modest circumstances, he'd excelled in school and earned admission to the Armavir Higher Military Aviation School. He learned to fly the MiG-21, then transitioned to the prized MiG-25 assignment in 1974. To his fellow pilots and commanding officers, Belenko seemed the model Soviet airman, disciplined, skilled, politically reliable. He'd joined the Communist Party, he'd married and had a son. He flew the most advanced interceptor in the world from a base near the Pacific coast, standing eternal vigilance against American aggression. But Belenko was disillusioned. He'd grown up reading sanitized Soviet newspapers while hearing whispered truths about corruption, shortages, and the gulf between propaganda and reality. Service in the military exposed him to the privileges of the officer class and the poverty of ordinary citizens. I watched generals drive black Volgas while factory workers lived in communal apartments with no hot water. He later told American debriefings. I was told we were building communism, but all I saw was a new aristocracy wearing red stars instead of noble titles. The final straw came during a military ceremony when a colonel drunkenly boasted about connections that had secured his son admission to university. Admission Belenko knew was supposedly based on merit. The hypocrisy crystallized something in the young pilot. He began planning his defection in early 1976. The risks were absolute. If caught before takeoff, he'd face execution for treason. If Soviet interceptors caught him airborne, they might shoot him down. Party ideology mattered less than protecting state secrets. If he miscalculated his fuel and crashed into the Sea of Japan, he'd simply drown. If Japanese air defenses mistook him for an attack and shot him down, he'd die within sight of freedom. But Belenko had calculated something else. He possessed information the Americans desperately wanted, and he could deliver it wrapped in 20 tons of Soviet aerospace engineering. He would defect not as a refugee begging for asylum, but as a prize asset making a transaction. At precisely 12:48 p.m. on September 6, 1976, Viktor Belenko received clearance for takeoff from Chuguyevka Air Base. The weather was clear. His MiG-25P bore tail number 31 red and carried a full weapons load, 4 R-40 air-to-air missiles under the wings. To maintain the appearance of a routine training sortie, ground control confirmed his flight plan. A standard intercept training exercise over the Sea of Japan, remaining within Soviet territorial airspace, expected flight duration 90 minutes. Belenko acknowledged with professional brevity, released the brakes, and felt 2 Tumansky R-15B-300 engines accelerate him down the runway. At 215 knots, the nose lifted. At 250 knots, the massive interceptor broke free of the Earth. For exactly 90 seconds, Belenko flew according to his filed flight plan, climbing steadily southeast toward the training area. His radio discipline was perfect. His transponders squawked the correct friendly codes. Then, at 12:49:30 p.m., he made his move. The MiG-25 suddenly banked hard right, dropping to low altitude, accelerating toward Japan. The airspeed indicator climbed past 600 knots as he descended to just 500 feet above the waves, low enough to duck under Soviet radar coverage. The change was so abrupt that ground controllers initially assumed equipment malfunction or spatial disorientation. 31 red. Confirm your heading, the controller transmitted. Professional calm masking rising concern. Belenko did not respond. He was already 40 miles from Soviet territory, screaming across the Sea of Japan at 650 knots. Radio switched off. Transponder darkened. He was a ghost. At 12:52 p.m., 3 minutes after Belenko's course deviation, Chuguyevka Tower declared an emergency. Within 6 minutes, scramble orders went to 2 MiG-23 interceptors at a nearby base. But those 6 minutes gave Belenko a 65-mile head start, and he was flying the fastest interceptor in the Soviet inventory. The MiG-23s would never catch him. A more terrible option presented itself to the duty officer at Far East Military District Headquarters. Soviet surface-to-air missile sites along the coast had theoretical range to his estimated position. Authorization to fire on a Soviet aircraft required approval from Moscow. The message went up the chain. Defecting pilot, carrying classified aircraft and weapon systems, heading for Japan. Shoot him down. The question reached General Nikolai Ogarkov, chief of the Soviet General Staff in Moscow. The decision paralyzed him. Destroying the aircraft would preserve its secrets, but would confirm to the world that the USSR was willing to murder its own pilots. Letting him reach Japan would hand the Americans the intelligence coup of the decade. Ogarkov delayed, requesting confirmation, seeking guidance from the Politburo. Those precious minutes sealed Belenko's escape. At 1:08 p.m., Japanese air defense radar detected an unidentified aircraft approaching from the northwest at very high speed and extremely low altitude. The track was anomalous. Too fast for a civilian aircraft, too low for commercial traffic, wrong direction for scheduled flights, no transponder, no radio contact. 2 F-4EJ Phantom fighters on alert at Chaitos Air Base received scramble orders. They never got airborne in time. At 1:11 p.m., Viktor Belenko pulled back on the stick, popping the MiG-25 up to 1,500 feet for visual navigation. Ahead lay Hakodate Airport on Hokkaido's southern coast, a civilian field with a 2,000-meter runway, just barely long enough for the 300-meter landing roll of a MiG-25 if he got everything perfect. The city of Hakodate spread below him in the early afternoon sun. He had perhaps 2 minutes of fuel remaining. There would be no second chances. Tower personnel at Hakodate Airport watched in stunned disbelief as an enormous gray fighter jet, unlike anything in Japanese or American inventory, materialized from the north without warning or radio contact. It was traveling far too fast for a normal landing approach. Air traffic controller Takeshi Akutsu later described his shock. "I saw this huge aircraft coming straight at the runway, much too fast, much too steep. I thought it was going to crash." Belenko dropped his landing gear, deployed his drag chute manually, fought the controls as the MiG-25 slammed onto the runway at 310 kilometers per hour, dangerously above normal landing speed. The brakes screamed, the tires smoked, the drag chute blossomed behind him, straining against the massive momentum. The MiG-25 rolled 1,800 meters down the runway, stopping just 200 meters from the end. Belenko popped the canopy. Cool Japanese air flooded the cockpit. He had made it. What happened in the next 13 minutes became the subject of intense diplomatic controversy. Belenko climbed from the cockpit carrying only his pistol and a small survival kit. Japanese airport workers and a few local police officers approached cautiously. Belenko spoke no Japanese. They spoke no Russian. Using gestures and broken English, he communicated his intention. Asylum, America, important information. The police detained him courteously but firmly. This was a diplomatic incident of the highest order. Within minutes, Japanese Self-Defense Force officers arrived. Within an hour, word reached Tokyo. Prime Minister Takeo Miki faced an immediate crisis. Soviet Ambassador Dmitry Polyansky was already demanding the immediate return of both pilot and aircraft, invoking multiple international agreements. The Americans were urgently requesting access to both. And Belenko's MiG-25 sat on a civilian runway in full view of local journalists already snapping photographs. In Moscow, the Politburo convened an emergency session at 3:00 a.m. local time. The mood was fury and panic in equal measure. "This is worse than losing a battle," Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev reportedly raged. "This is betrayal compounded by humiliation." KGB Chairman Yuri Andropov began immediate damage control. Belenko's wife Ludmila and young son were placed under house arrest. His parents faced intensive questioning. Soviet media prepared cover stories. The pilot had been disoriented, mentally unstable, possibly kidnapped by Japanese agents. Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko personally called his Japanese counterpart, demanding immediate repatriation under the 1956 Soviet-Japanese Joint Declaration. But everyone knew the truth. The Americans would get access to that MiG-25. The question was only how much the Japanese government would pretend otherwise. For the next 67 days, in a hangar at Hyakuri Air Base northwest of Tokyo, American and Japanese engineers conducted the most comprehensive intelligence examination of a Soviet weapon system in Cold War history. The operation, codenamed Have Donut by the CIA, involved over 120 specialists, aerospace engineers from the Air Force Foreign Technology Division, CIA technical intelligence officers, representatives from major defense contractors, and Japanese self-defense force personnel. They worked under extreme time pressure, knowing Soviet diplomatic pressure was intense and Japanese public opinion was divided. Every component would be documented, measured, photographed, and analyzed. Then, to preserve diplomatic fiction, the aircraft would be returned to the Soviets, but only after its secrets were thoroughly compromised. What they discovered rewrote Western understanding of Soviet aerospace engineering. The revelations came in layers, each challenging different assumptions. First, the basics. The MiG-25 was far heavier than estimated. Its 41,200-pound empty weight made it one of the heaviest fighter aircraft ever built, nearly twice the weight of an F-15 Eagle. The reason became clear when engineers examined the airframe. Approximately 80% was nickel steel alloy, spot-welded rather than using advanced bonding techniques. "We were shocked," recalled Ben Rich, a senior engineer from Lockheed's Skunk Works who participated in the examination. "We'd assumed titanium construction. Instead, we found what was essentially a very sophisticated steel aircraft." This wasn't necessarily a weakness. Steel's high melting point made it suitable for sustained high-speed flight, but it revealed Soviet manufacturing limitations. The engines told a more complex story. The Tumansky R-15B-300 turbojets were brute force masterpieces, capable of generating 24,700 pounds of thrust each on afterburner. But they consumed fuel at staggering rates. The aircraft carried 14,000 liters of fuel, yet had a combat radius of only about 700 kilometers. More critically, examination revealed that sustained flight above Mach 2.5 caused severe engine degradation. The engines were designed for brief periods at maximum speed, a Foreign Technology Division report noted. Extended operation above Mach 2.5 would result in catastrophic failure within minutes. The fabled Mach 3 capability was theoretical, achievable only in brief bursts and only at extreme risk to the aircraft. The MiG-25's much-feared speed turned out to be a sprint capability, not a sustained performance characteristic. The avionics suite provided the biggest surprise and the most valuable intelligence. The Smerch-A radar, while powerful with a detection range of up to 90 kilometers against large targets, was built around vacuum tube technology rather than the solid-state electronics that had become standard in Western systems. When we opened the avionics bays, we thought we were looking at 1950s technology, one CIA analyst recalled. The vacuum tubes were massive, some as large as flashlights, enclosed in elaborate cooling systems to prevent overheating. This wasn't simply technological backwardness, however. Soviet engineers had specifically chosen tubes because they were resistant to electromagnetic pulse effects from nuclear explosions, a critical consideration for an interceptor expected to operate in a nuclear war environment. Western solid-state electronics offered better performance, but were vulnerable to EMP. It was a trade-off that revealed different design philosophies. American aircraft assumed electronic warfare and precision. Soviet aircraft assumed nuclear battlefields and robust simplicity. The weapon systems reinforced this pattern, The 4 R-40 missiles Belenko had carried were enormous, each weighing over 450 kilograms, and designed for a single mission: destroying enemy bombers at long range. They carried either 70-kilogram conventional warheads or tactical nuclear warheads yielding several kilotons. The fire control system was optimized for straight-line interceptions of large, non-maneuvering targets. The entire aircraft was purpose-built for one scenario, noted a Rand Corporation analysis prepared after the examination. Intercept an American B-52 or B-1 bomber penetrating Soviet airspace at high altitude. At that specific mission, it was probably very effective. At anything else, air combat maneuvering, ground attack, even intercepting smaller targets, it was mediocre to poor. But the most valuable intelligence wasn't about capabilities. It was about vulnerabilities. American electronic warfare specialists identified specific radar frequencies and operational patterns. They mapped the aircraft's blind spots. They discovered that the Smerch-A radar, while powerful, had poor look-down performance. It struggled to distinguish low-flying aircraft from ground clutter. This explained why Soviet tactics emphasized high-altitude interceptions. Western aircraft, equipped with better look-down capability and more sophisticated avionics, could exploit these weaknesses. Within months of the examination, American electronic warfare systems were being reconfigured with specific MiG-25 countermeasures. Strategic bomber penetration routes were revised to exploit the Foxbat's limitations. The Soviets, meanwhile, faced their own reckoning. On November 15, 1976, after prolonged negotiations, the Japanese government returned the MiG-25 to Soviet custody, disassembled into pieces, packed into crates, with obvious evidence of comprehensive examination. The return ceremony at Hakodate Airport was staged for diplomatic purposes, but Soviet Air Force officers who inventoried the pieces knew immediately that every system had been compromised. They didn't even try to hide it, one Soviet engineer later told a Russian aviation historian. The Americans had been through everything. The damage went beyond one aircraft. Every MiG-25 in Soviet service would need upgraded systems, revised tactics, and additional security measures. The cost in both resources and reputation was enormous. The American response to the Foxbat revelations rippled through defense policy at multiple levels. Within 3 months of the examination's completion, the Air Force revised its tactical doctrine for engagements with Soviet interceptors. F-15 pilots received updated briefings emphasizing low-altitude approach, electronic countermeasures targeting specific MiG-25 radar frequencies, and exploitation of the Foxbat's poor low-speed maneuverability. We went from fearing this aircraft to having a detailed playbook for defeating it, recalled Colonel David McLeod, who flew F-15s in Europe during the late 1970s. Strategic bomber pilots received even more specific guidance. Penetrate Soviet airspace at low altitude where the MiG-25's radar performance degraded. Use terrain masking. Force the interceptors into scenarios where their advantages disappeared. More significantly, the revelation that Soviet avionics lagged Western systems by nearly a decade bolstered arguments for accelerated development of American precision-guided weapons and advanced electronics. Defense Secretary Harold Brown noted in a 1977 speech that the Belenko defection confirmed our technological edge in critical areas. Pentagon budget allocations shifted noticeably. Less emphasis on matching Soviet numbers, more investment in qualitative superiority through advanced electronics, better radar, superior targeting systems. The F-16 Fighting Falcon, entering service in 1978, incorporated lessons from the MiG-25 examination. Fly-by-wire controls giving superior maneuverability, advanced radar with excellent look-down capability, and sophisticated electronic warfare systems specifically designed to exploit Soviet radar weaknesses. The fighter cost only $15 million per unit, compared to the F-15's $28 million. Partly because confidence in American technological superiority meant less gold plating was deemed necessary. Soviet countermeasures were both tactical and strategic. Within the air defense forces, MiG-25 units received emergency technical upgrades throughout 1977. The most critical change involved radar modifications to improve look-down performance and counter American electronic warfare capabilities. New operational protocols emphasized lower altitude intercepts and cooperation with ground-based radar systems to compensate for the MiG-25's identified weaknesses. Soviet engineers developed updated missile systems with better electronic countermeasures. But perhaps the most significant response was cultural. Security protocols for handling advanced weapon systems became draconian. Soviet pilots faced intensified political screening, more intensive monitoring, and severe restrictions on foreign contact. After Belenko, they trusted nobody, recalled a former Soviet Air Force officer who defected in the 1980s. The paranoia was suffocating. The diplomatic fallout strained Soviet-Japanese relations for years. Moscow never forgave Tokyo's decision to allow American examination of the aircraft, viewing it as a betrayal of the implicit understanding that neutral nations would maintain equidistance between superpowers. Trade negotiations stalled. Cultural exchanges were curtailed. Soviet fishing vessels faced increased harassment in disputed waters near the Kuril Islands. Japanese Prime Minister Takeo Miki defended the decision as legally complicated. Belenko had requested asylum, the aircraft had landed without permission, and international law provided no clear precedent. But privately, Japanese officials acknowledged they had chosen alignment with the United States over accommodation with the USSR. The Cold War's ideological divide left little room for genuine neutrality, even for nations that claimed it. The incident also accelerated Soviet development of next-generation interceptors. The Mikoyan Design Bureau, humiliated by the Foxbat's exposure, began work on what would become the MiG-31, a radical improvement incorporating many of the lessons learned from Belenko's defection. The MiG-31, entering service in 1981, featured genuine pulse Doppler radar capable of tracking multiple low-altitude targets, solid-state avionics, and significantly improved range. It retained the basic MiG-25 airframe but represented a technological leap in capability. Ironically, by forcing the Soviets to accelerate their development timeline, Belenko's defection ultimately spurred creation of a more capable interceptor than might otherwise have emerged. Within the intelligence community, the Belenko case became a template for handling high-value defectors. The CIA refined its debriefing protocols, improving methods for extracting technical information from military personnel who lacked formal engineering training. New guidelines emphasized rapid technical assessment of defectors' potential intelligence value. The agency established specialized teams trained specifically in Soviet aerospace systems, ready to deploy worldwide when opportunities arose. Belenko proved that technical intelligence could come from the most unexpected sources, noted a retrospective CIA analysis. A disgruntled junior officer gave us more concrete information about the MiG-25 than 10 years of satellite photography and signals intelligence combined. For Viktor Belenko personally, the defection meant permanent exile and constant vigilance. The CIA relocated him to the United States, provided a new identity, and set him up in a comfortable but modest life. Soviet intelligence services never stopped hunting him. KGB assassination teams operating in the West received standing orders to eliminate the traitor if opportunity arose. Belenko's wife Ludmila divorced him in absentia, remarried a KGB officer in what was clearly a staged political gesture, and raised their son to denounce his father as a traitor. They made my family a propaganda tool, Belenko later reflected bitterly in interviews. He eventually wrote a memoir, MiG Pilot, published in 1980, which provided even more detailed insights into Soviet Air Force operations, training methods, and the daily realities of life in the military elite. The book sold well in the West and infuriated Moscow, confirming their worst fears about defectors who talk too much. By January 1977, 4 months after the initial examination, the full intelligence assessment of the MiG-25 reached President Jimmy Carter's desk. The 247-page classified report, prepared by the Foreign Technology Division with input from CIA, NSA, and multiple defense contractors, represented one of the most comprehensive technical intelligence coups of the Cold War. Carter read portions of it during a Camp David weekend briefing, reportedly commenting that, "We've been chasing shadows," in reference to decades of worst-case assessments about Soviet capabilities. The report's conclusions were simultaneously reassuring and troubling. Soviet technology was less advanced than feared in several critical areas, but their design philosophy emphasized robustness and mass production in ways that presented different challenges than anticipated. The strategic implications extended far beyond a single aircraft type. American intelligence agencies revised their estimates of overall Soviet technological capabilities downward in several categories: aerospace materials, science, miniaturized electronics, manufacturing precision, while adjusting upward their assessment of Soviet pragmatism in engineering design. "They weren't trying to match us pound for pound," explained a senior Defense Intelligence Agency analyst. "They were building weapons optimized for their specific doctrines, using technologies they could actually produce at scale." This insight proved crucial for accurate assessment of other Soviet weapon systems. When evaluating Soviet tanks, submarines, or surface-to-air missiles, analysts now looked for this pattern: simpler design, proven technology, emphasis on reliability and mass production over cutting-edge performance. The economic dimension was equally significant. Soviet investment in the MiG-25 program, estimated at over 3 billion rubles in development and production costs, had been partially wasted. The aircraft was now compromised, requiring expensive modifications across an operational fleet of approximately 400 interceptors. The diplomatic costs of the defection, including strained relations with Japan and loss of prestige, compounded the damage. For a Soviet economy already struggling with stagnation, military inefficiency, and resource allocation challenges, this represented a substantial blow. CIA economic analysts noted in classified reports that the MiG-25 debacle likely contributed to growing skepticism within Soviet leadership about massive weapons development programs. By the early 1980s, under Yuri Andropov's leadership, the USSR was pursuing more modest, incremental improvements to existing systems rather than expensive revolutionary projects. In Western Europe, NATO commanders revised defensive strategies based on the new intelligence. The alliance's integrated air defense system, designed partly to counter the MiG-25 threat, was restructured to emphasize capabilities against more numerous but less sophisticated Soviet interceptors. Resources shifted toward countering the massive fleets of MiG-21s, MiG-23s, and Su-15s that formed the backbone of Soviet tactical aviation. American F-15s and F-16s stationed in Germany received updated mission profiles. British Tornadoes and French Mirages trained against realistic MiG-25 performance parameters rather than inflated estimates. The confidence boost was palpable. Western pilots no longer faced an invincible adversary, but rather a known quantity with exploitable weaknesses. For the Soviet Union, the psychological impact extended beyond military circles. The defection fed growing disillusionment among educated Soviets about their system's technological prowess. If the most advanced fighter aircraft in the inventory was actually compromised by outdated technology, what else were they being told that wasn't true? The official narrative of Soviet technological superiority already strained by persistent consumer shortages and industrial inefficiencies, took another hit. Dissidents like Andrei Sakharov privately noted that the Belenko affair demonstrated the gap between propaganda and reality. "We were told we were building the future," Sakharov wrote in his diary. Viktor Belenko showed us we were building monuments to past thinking with current resources. The precedent set by successful defection also haunted Soviet security services. Between 1976 and 1985, at least 17 Soviet military pilots attempted defections, most unsuccessful, but the attempts themselves revealing widespread discontent. The KGB responded with increasingly intrusive surveillance of military personnel, creating a climate of suspicion that undermined unit cohesion. After Belenko, every pilot was a potential traitor, recalled a former Soviet Air Force political officer. The commissars watched us constantly, checked our mail, interviewed our wives. It destroyed trust. This internal paranoia imposed its own costs on combat readiness and operational effectiveness. Viktor Belenko's audacious flight fundamentally altered the intelligence landscape of the late Cold War. His defection proved that human intelligence, a single courageous individual willing to risk everything, could achieve what satellites, signals intercepts, and billions in technical collection could not: complete access to an adversary's most secret weapon system. The CIA and other Western intelligence services refocused significant resources toward recruiting high-value Soviet defectors, recognizing that technological secrets were vulnerable to human betrayal in ways that no security system could fully prevent. By the mid-1980s, this emphasis on human intelligence collection would pay extraordinary dividends through sources like Oleg Gordievsky and Adolf Tolkachev, who provided even more strategic intelligence than Belenko. The technological revelations accelerated America's investment in qualitative military superiority over quantitative matching of Soviet forces. Defense planners, confident that American electronics, radar, and precision weapons held substantial advantages, pursued strategies emphasizing these strengths. This approach culminated in the 1991 Gulf War, where American and Allied forces demonstrated overwhelming technological superiority against Soviet-equipped Iraqi forces. Iraqi MiG-25s, modernized variants of Belenko's aircraft, proved largely ineffective against American F-15s and F-16s, employing tactics developed partly from insights gained 15 years earlier. The war validated the strategic bet on quality over quantity that the Belenko defection had encouraged. For the Soviet Union, the incident contributed to the slow unraveling of confidence that preceded glasnost and perestroika. By revealing gaps between propaganda and reality, technological promise and actual capability, the defection fed skepticism among Soviet elites about their system's viability. When Mikhail Gorbachev initiated reforms in 1985, he confronted a military-industrial complex already aware that Soviet technology lagged the West in critical areas. The Belenko case had made this undeniable. Some historians argue that the psychological impact of such revelations, technological inferiority, economic inefficiency, the willingness of talented officers to betray the system, contributed to the eventual collapse of Soviet confidence in their model. Belenko himself lived quietly in the United States for decades, working as an aerospace consultant, giving occasional interviews, and watching from afar as the system he'd betrayed crumbled. He never returned to Russia, even after the Soviet Union's collapse made it theoretically possible. "There are people there who will never forgive me," he reflected in a 2000 interview. "I gave the Americans something invaluable: knowledge. In the Cold War, knowledge determined survival." He died in relative obscurity, his contribution known to intelligence professionals but not widely celebrated in public memory. yet his impact endured in policy documents, weapons systems, and strategic calculations that shaped the Cold War's final chapter. The MiG-25 itself, the specific aircraft that landed at Hakodate on that September afternoon, was eventually displayed at the Soviet Air Force Museum near Moscow, bearing the notation, "Returned from Japan, 1976," with no mention of defection or examination. Soviet visitors were told it had been involved in a navigation error. The truth, of course, was known to anyone who cared to look. The aircraft represented both Soviet engineering capability and its limitations, both the Cold War's technological race and the human decisions that shaped it. One pilot, one flight, one decision, and the balance of the superpower rivalry shifted measurably. Viktor Belenko had handed the West their best fighter. In doing so, he revealed that the true vulnerability in the Cold War was never just technology or ideology, but the fragile loyalty of individuals who could choose, in moments of conscience or conviction, to change history.